So it's a short gospel reading, but our contemporary reading shows that one can fill a lot of the spaces in with imagination. So I started with looking at the gospel reading for today, and I thought, well, I know this story too well, and maybe many of us do. When I saw that it was the gospel reading for today, I showed it to a friend to see what she thought. My friend said, "It's hard to interpret the Bible. Mary seems to get away with blue murder and be praised." I had to agree. The funny thing is that when I was young, I didn't think much about Martha. I had no desire to get bogged down in practical tasks, say in the kitchen, just not interested. I'd rather go Mary's way any day, get involved in the stimulating conversation and learning that was going on in the lounge room. Don't be a Martha, the saying goes. So effectively, I silenced Martha. But now I'm getting older, I see it differently. I find myself identifying with Martha, how certain tasks seem to fall to her, and how unfair it seems. She gets a raw deal. When Martha protests, she seems to focus her resentment on her sister Mary. She doesn't even ask, what about Lazarus? But I hadn't thought of Lazarus in that way, but perhaps he wasn't well or wasn't able. But there's certainly no mention of anyone else offering to help her at all. Of course, like many, I presumed the story to be about the choices that women must make, or the tension which women embody, balancing domestic tasks on the one hand with the tasks of listening to and getting involved with bigger, more interesting things. So is this a story about women? The story can be regarded as having important things to say about the place of women. Some who study these texts claim that Luke is enhancing the role of women, and others assert that he is restricting women's roles. I see Jesus and Luke, who was assembling the stories about him, as being people of their time, with no way of imagining life as we know it in the 21st century. In their world, a woman was dependent on a man, be it her father or her husband, all the days of her life. To be unmarried or a widow would place a woman in a precarious position. Even today, the same could be said of women in many societies in the world, including some groups in Australia. Luke depicts instances of Jesus connecting with women in a way that challenged their subordinate status. Writers such as Paul make statements in their letters about relationships between women and men in the congregations. But these statements, I think, need to be read in light of Jesus' own statements or own teachings. We also need to understand how the early Christian movement was conducting itself under some pressure, trying to avoid making unnecessary waves to reassure the Roman world that the Christian movement was no threat to Roman values. So, in our gospel reading, Mary and Martha are depicted in the setting of their home. Mary chooses to leave the domestic responsibilities to listen and learn. The expression "to sit at Jesus' feet" meant that she took the stance of a disciple. So I wonder if actually Mary's stance as a listener is like this, as we see it in art, at Jesus' feet, literally, or more like this, involving questioning and challenging. Her choice to be there may have been a bit unconventional, although there is evidence that some rabbis at the time did encourage the education of daughters, even in the Torah. Jesus' defense of Mary's choice could be a liberating message for a woman in a community where her role did not include receiving an education. We're not told whether then Mary is charged with responsibility to pass on or apply what she learns. And I'm still wondering, what about the job of hospitality? Does Mary's liberation depend on her leaving this work to Mary? Is Martha's work devalued? All this leads me to my next question. How do we read such text, which is around 2,000 years old, with fresh eyes to see if it has wisdom for us today? We can look at the story in isolation, or we could look at it in the context of the whole of Luke's Gospel. In particular, what comes directly before this story and what comes directly afterwards. In the general lead up to the story, Jesus is travelling around with his disciples, including some women. Disciples had been sent off in pairs, and people such as Mary and Martha were essential to this mission, for example, by way of hospitality. And those who were sent out were instructed to receive what was ever provided with acceptance. Possibly also from their home as a hub in Bethany, the two sisters may have contributed to the movement locally in an ongoing way, including when Jesus was not there. Now, the story that immediately precedes, going before the story of Mary and Martha, is the parable of the man who fell among thieves, commonly known as the parable of the Good Samaritan. This story arose when a lawyer asks Jesus about what one must do to inherit eternal life. Jesus answers in terms of the two great commandments, being to love God and to love one's neighbour. The lawyer had continued to press Jesus by seeking a boundary definition. Who is my neighbour? Jesus then told the story about how, faced with a man lying injured by the road, various people of religious learning, people who we could have expected to do the right thing, failed to respond. However, a person from an enemy or outsider group was the one to act with compassion. So this story illustrates how it's doing something that counts. Then we're on to Mary and Martha. At first, this story, paired with the Good Samaritan, could seem like a contradiction. The Good Samaritan stresses the importance of action. With Mary and Martha, is it inaction which is being praised? So what is the author's intention here? A closer look reveals that Martha has, in fact, just enacted exactly what Jesus was talking about in the Good Samaritan story. When she encounters Jesus travelling along the road, she welcomes and assists him. She demonstrates the love of neighbour. But there is a problem. It seems that in Jesus' time, as in our own, it was possible to get caught up in busyness at the expense of focus. We also have substantial things to do simply in living, supporting ourselves, perhaps a family too, working to pay the bills, finding and maintaining a home, doing work that's important, say with the church or for a cause, improving the lives of others in some way, responding to those around us, such as for care or companionship. It's true that being productive often means being busy, but it's only true up to a point. Busyness is not always effectiveness. As we all know from experience, staying busy can have damaging effects on our well-being. More stress, exhaustion, and an inability to focus on the present. Martha's experience seems to highlight this. Her predicament is one that is common to hosts. Perhaps she has anxieties that many of us would experience when we have guests coming. She might worry about the presentation of her home. Is it tidy? Is it clean enough? If not, will I be judged? Will the meal be ready in time? How do I juggle that when I'm serving drinks? I hope the food turns out okay. Will my guests be impressed with the meal? How will I measure up? Martha is in danger of getting so bogged down in the details of hospitality that she misses the point of the whole exercise, which is to enjoy the company of her guest. One can become so overwhelmed with tasks that you reach a tipping point, a point where everything falls apart because you can no longer withstand the weight of your commitments. Once you've reached that point, it becomes fairly obvious you're overcommitted. Martha seems to be overburdened and she loses it. She appeals to her distinguished guest, "Do you not care?" And she demands that he tell her sister to help her. Perhaps Jesus is trying to help Martha to recognize the signs of being too busy before she reaches that tipping point. He doesn't give her the response she expected. That's not unusual, is it? But he says with sympathy, "Martha, Martha, you are distracted by many things." So some translate as distracted. Martha may have been surprised by Jesus' use of the word distracted. "Excuse me, you're saying that I'm distracted? Wasn't it Mary who was distracted from helping me with the practical tasks?" Jesus also described her as anxious, troubled, or according to one translation, putting herself in an uproar. However, it seems that Jesus wants to help Martha to see few things are really necessary, or even one. In other words, try to make some decisions about what is most important and what is less necessary. This involves slowing down, taking time to feel and to process, to focus on what is the important or the necessary thing that is there in front of us. Understood in isolation, this story might seem to be about women and women's work. However, in other stories, Luke depicts Jesus as admonishing one host or another, including male disciples. So we could reasonably move away from the focus on gender. Instead, this story can be seen as expressing concern for ways of being a host, or actually ways of being a disciple, or a human being, male or female. It's a story for any of us when we struggle to be present to what is the important thing. For example, the story could express concern for the parent who, watching his child play soccer, is so keen to tell her what she should be doing out there on the field that he misses the one important thing. His child wants his affirmation that she's actually having a go. We human beings are challenged. It's so easy to miss the important thing. Perhaps our story presents just one brief instance of disagreement between Martha and Mary in an otherwise healthy relationship. Perhaps Mary's experience of listening to Jesus inspires her to meaningful action. Perhaps Martha responds to Jesus' guidance to reconnect with what had inspired her in the first place. In other parts of the Bible, the two sisters appear unified, just as two aspects of life, action and reflection, or love of neighbour and love of God, are reconciled. Mary and Martha can be seen to personify two aspects in the life of one person, in tension sometimes, but at best integrated. In the parable of the man left behind, injured by robbers, the Samaritan man may have had commitments, but he interrupts his journey to tend to the injuries of the man injured by the road. His one needful thing was to aid a fellow human being in distress. Martha, likewise, is also prompted to interrupt the tasks associated with hospitality to attend to her one needful thing, which is to be with Jesus. It's also quite interesting to note that the Good Samaritan concludes with the words, "Go and do likewise." And the story, which immediately follows Mary and Martha's story, opens with a disciple asking, "Lord, teach us how to pray." Understood together, the two stories, the Good Samaritan paired up with Mary and Martha, illustrate that the love of God means nothing without care of our neighbour, and care for our neighbour requires care of ourselves by listening to God. So in answer to the lawyer who questioned Jesus, the love of God and the compassion for our fellow human beings are one and the same. Action and reflection are inseparable, integrated into what has come to be called the greatest commandment. In fact, Mary and Martha need each other. In our world, Martha and Mary continue to express themselves. Brené Brown, for example, is a social researcher who speaks about the power of allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. While many of us are afraid of vulnerability, busyness seems to provide a numbing effect or a distraction, much like alcohol or other drugs. It's almost as if we stay busy enough, the truth of our lives won't catch up with us. Then all of a sudden, circumstances can change and we have some free time. Surprisingly, this isn't always comfortable for us. I'll just want to share some examples of things, vulnerable things, that people can become aware of once they're in this space. A fear of being ordinary, unworthy, unlovable, unless I'm overachieving. Or thoughts about our parents or other precious people who are getting older and we don't get to see them or talk with them very often. Perhaps we pull away because we're terrified of losing them. A marriage that is lacking nourishment. Or children who are growing up fast and we've missed some of their important moments or missed opportunities to connect with them. Many people live with feelings of loss and grief or trauma. There are feelings about being, or feelings unsettled when one has time to wonder about life and about one's purpose. We can feel a lack of confidence to sustain real relationships with people who know and love us. It's easy to get distracted from this when we spend time online communicating with people who seem to care about what we have to say there. There are feelings of restlessness or loneliness unless I am busy doing things to help others. We struggle to be present to feelings like these. Distractions can be needed at times. But if we allow ourselves, these feelings can lead us into connection. I think we've all experienced moments that touch the kind of life and the kind of connection that Jesus talks about when he says, "I have come that you may have life and live it to the full." These kinds of moments are compelling, wonderful. Moments like this awaken us. We relish that life. We want more. Tasting life in that way, we know that we don't want to be distracted from it. I don't want to miss my life. So what's the answer? I believe that this story teaches us that being busy with a purpose is good. Jesus values Martha's good actions which contribute to the work of God in the world. There's no suggestion that Mary is choosing to be in a state of perpetual listening and learning and that she isn't doing anything. But for Martha, just in this moment, with Jesus as her guest, and bearing in mind that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem and will not be with them forever, is encouraging Martha to pause for something that will nourish her. But still, for goodness sake, can someone please give Martha a hand? Some are in circumstances with very limited control over their choices. I'm thinking of, for example, people in poverty whose labour is exploited, or people with limited support from others caring for people who depend on them. Perhaps Martha had some choice in that moment to rethink her priorities, for example, to simplify the meal or eat later. Sometimes, however, those of us with more choice can do what we can to give another person a needed break. We all need to balance action with quiet times, identified as prayer. So what nourishes you? Many people, myself included, to some extent, can be alienated by the words prayer or God, with all their meanings and all their limitations. However, I believe there are millions of ways in which we might love God or we might pray, and most of these things might never be named as prayer. So here are just a few examples. We might get outside, fill our lungs with fresh air and feel good to be alive. We enjoy loving physical contact. We relish human gifts we have and we live life with gratitude. We connect with the arts, such as music. We enjoy and care for creation. We honour cultural heritage, our shared history, our sense of place in this country. We appreciate details of life we mostly take for granted. What we are doing in such examples are things that bring us a sense of okayness or harmony, by which we understand ourselves to be worthy and sacred, connected to one another as fellow human beings by a love that is greater than ourselves. However we name our experiences, we know that we do need to allow time for them. Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote a book called Gift from the Sea in the early 1950s, and I think she put it well when she said, "This is what one thirsts for, I realise, after the smallness of the day, of work, of details, even of communication. One thirsts for the magnitude and the universality of a night full of stars pouring into one like a fresh tide." Amen.